Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity hosted by the Maine Department of Education. My name is Joe Schmidt. I am the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, we have two featured guests with us today. Kate McMahon, who is from the Smithsonian Institution, National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Kate Weber from the Maine State Museum. Kate McMahon is here to talk to us today about some of the pedagogy and background when it comes to teaching Maine's relationship to global slavery with primary sources. And then following Kate McMahon's part of the presentation, Kate Weber will talk about a set of primary sources that have been compiled that focus on Maine's role and connections with slavery. The primary source set that Kate Weber is going to be showing you is part of an ongoing series of work that's being done in collaboration between the Maine Department of Education, with myself, with the Maine State Museum, Maine State Archives, Maine State Library, and Maine Historical Society. We've all been working for, I think, a little more than a year now on seeing where we could bring these collections together. In working on this primary source set, we decided to reach out to Kate McMahon, who some of you may have had the opportunity to see, like I did, see her speak last summer, the summer of 2019, at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center, where she was a featured speaker in this. So I'm going to let each of them take just a quick second to introduce themselves before we turn it over to Kate McMahon to start us off. So let's start with Kate Weber. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm a lead educator at the Maine State Museum. I'm so excited to have everyone here today. And I'll be presenting a set of primary sources that are ready to take into your classroom, and looking forward to talking to you in a little bit.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Joe and Kate, for inviting me and coordinating this great event. I am from Maine, so everybody knows I'm from Shapley, which is in York County. I went to USM for my master's and my bachelor's, and then I went to Howard University in DC for my PhD. And I've been at the Smithsonian since 2014. Currently I work in the Center for the Study of Global Slavery, and I work on a couple of really interesting global projects that deal with the intersections of slavery, material culture, history, memory, and social justice. So I'm going to talk today, I'm going to try to breeze through this, and please interrupt me if you have any questions, or put a question in the Q&A, and Kate Weber will read it to me. So I'm going to cover a lot of terrain geographically, temporally, and in terms of what we'll be talking about today. So what do we mean by global? This is a question I like to start with when I give this presentation. And really what we're beginning to understand about the history of slavery and what really has transpired in the last 30 or 40 years in the historiography of slavery is this shifting away from these ideas of the domination of academia by the study of American slavery, and really understanding how slavery was a global economy, and really one of the first capitalistic, truly global capitalistic endeavors that was embarked upon in the world. And of course, this ties into a lot of other histories. And you know, one of the things I'd like to encourage you all as teachers is to think about not just siloing the history of slavery to a unit, or to talking about the Civil War, for example, but really to think about how slavery fits into every single period that you're discussing. Every single world event in some way has been shaped by this particular history, because it ties to the history of colonialism, it ties to the history of capitalism, it ties to all these other things. And so you'll see here on the top right screen that hopefully you can see it in the Zoom. You can look this up online. It's from slate.com. This is a piece of a map that was derived from slavevoyages.org. And I'm going to mention a bunch of different websites and places you can go for primary sources today. Slavevoyages.org is the largest database on the history of the transoceanic slave trade. And one thing that I is really important to understand when we think about the history of slavery is how deeply slavery affected the world. And you can see here on the map where the vast majority of slave journeys are going to, and that is South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And I'm going to pause here just for a second because I want to talk about what happens in 1807 and 1808. But overall, during the period of global slavery, over 12.5 million, at least, people left Africa. That is the number that we currently know of for journeys that were recorded in some way. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today with Maine's relationship to slavery is some of the reasons why our understanding of this history has been biased. And one of our understandings of the history of slavery in America is how important slavery was to the US South. But if you look at this map, only about 350,000 enslaved people were actually transported out of Africa into the United States. The vast majority of enslaved people were transported to Brazil and Cuba. And this has everything to do with the history of global sugar production primarily. This was a driving force. Slavery was a driving force in the colonization of all of these different parts of the world, as well as the introduction of all of these different commodities that eventually led us to the Industrial Revolution. And so really, without slavery, without the history of slavery, without enslaved people producing the raw materials that were created, that were turned into fabric or molasses for rum, without enslaved people doing this, we would not have an industrial revolution. So if you're thinking about, industrial revolution is obviously something that is taught in schools to lots of different age children. There are ways in which you can embark upon this subject by thinking about the whole supply chain. Where does the product start from, and where does it end up? And so slavery touched pretty much every continent in the world, even Asia. There were enslaved Africans were brought into Asia as early as the 8th century of the Common Era to work in salt marshes. There was a really important rebellion in the 9th century in what is now Iraq, Iran, called the Zanj Rebellion of Ethiopian or Swahili-speaking people that were brought there and led a 20-year rebellion against their slaveholders there. So this is a deep history that touched every continent in the world except for Antarctica in some way. So we can think about how this history affects us all. And it has an immense human toll. What does this mean? 15% on average, of people that left Africa died. So 15%, over at least 1.8 million people died during the Middle Passage. We don't know how many people died in Africa on their way to becoming slaves, because by the 17th century, the majority of enslaved people were being captured in the interior of Africa and marched to the coast to be sold. And so there was a whole other aspect of internal conflict within Africa that was being driven often by Western European colonizers that had impacted all of Africa, the interior and the coastal parts of Africa. And currently still shapes the way that conflicts are unrolling all over Africa in various regions where these imaginary boundaries were drawn by European powers that forced different ethnic groups to come together in areas where they would never have been together, and thus caused immense amounts of strife and warfare. So slavery was deeply important to the global economy, and we think about how we tend to think of Maine's merchant economy as something that is very separate from slavery. We think that we are on the right side of history, as we're on the right side of the Civil War. We think that we have we had nothing really to do with the slave trade, and that just simply isn't the case. And our entanglement with global slavery, Maine and northern New England's entanglement with global slavery, goes back to the very early colonial period. This slavery in Maine starts with the colonial project, which begins with the genocide of the indigenous Wabanaki and Abenaki peoples, as well as their enslavement. And Wabanaki people were, in particular after the Pequot Wars in the late 17th century, were sold into slavery and brought into the Caribbean and sold into plantations in the Caribbean. And this was because many New Englanders had deep ties to sugar production and plantations in the Caribbean. And one example here is William Pepperell. This document is one that's in the primary resource packet that Kate will be talking about later. This top document here is an escaped slave advertisement that he put into a Boston newspaper. And Pepperell was one of the largest slaveholders in the state of Maine. He owned probably the majority of enslaved people in Kittery during the late colonial period. He was not a benevolent slaveholder. And Pepperell, of course, is a very large name in York County. There's lots of places named after him. But you can see here in this advertisement, this letter dated June 25th, 1719, that Pepperell, who had purchased 5 enslaved people to be brought from his plantation in Antigua, and all of them died during the passage from Antigua to Maine. And the captain thought it was likely because they were just simply not given enough clothing. And so this is one element that tells you of that slavery was not benign in the state of Maine. Slavery was not kinder or better than it was in the South. It was as horrible and dehumanizing as it was anywhere else. So Pepperell was one of a number of slaveholders in York County. There was a slave market in the town of York as early as 1650 that we know of. So there certainly was regular sales and purchases of enslaved people in the towns in southern York County during the colonial period. By a 1754 census, there were approximately 154 enslaved men and women in the state of Maine that we know of. This is a little difficult to nail down because these early censuses were scattershot. A lot of people lived remote. They were not done in any kind of way that was sort of consistent with each other. But we do have an idea that that there was a significant presence of slaveholding in York County. So, slavery really was deeply impactful. And this is William Pepperell's will, which is, I believe, in the Maine State Archives. You can find it on Digital Maine, where you can see his purchases of enslaved people and enslaved people, clothing and things like that were accounted for in his will, which tells you that slavery was deeply pervasive in the state of Maine, despite the fact that slavery was officially abolished in 1784. That did not mean that Maine was an anti-racist place. And so we can really understand this through looking at some of the legal history of the state of Maine. And this fits well into, if you're talking about 1820 and the importance of the state's foundation. One of the first laws passed in Maine in our first constitution was a law barring interracial marriage between whites and African Americans or Native American people. And that law was in place in Maine by the 1770s, when it was still the District of Maine in the state of Massachusetts. And it was reaffirmed in Massachusetts' Constitution in 1795, where they passed a law that said, quote, any Negro, barring interracial marriages between any Negro, Indian, or mulatto on the penalty of the sum of 50 pounds, which is a very large sum of money for 1795. And this was not a law that was unenforced. On the right-hand side, this is a letter from the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, which you can find online, that was published on July 20th, 1845. A mixed-race English sailor named A.T. Wood wrote that he had married a white woman at an Anglican church in rural New Brunswick, Canada. And this woman was from Machias. Upon the couple's return to Machias in May of 1845, A.T. Wood was charged with fornication. The couple then fled over the boundary into Canada, where officers from Maine actually pursued them across the border and arrested A.T. Wood and jailed him at Machias, which was not legal. They could not legally pursue someone into Canada. And what he had done he had not married her in the United States. He had married her in Canada, yet he was still charged with fornication. So this is just one example. I don't know what happened to A.T. Wood after this. I've not been able to find any evidence of A.T. Wood after this letter and what happened to him. But, this is not the only incident. And this law was not repealed until 1883. But in practice, Maine courts continued to essentially enforce this all the way into at least the 1930s. I found another case where an African-American boxer from Lewiston married a Franco-American woman named Cecile Labby. And the state went through extraordinary steps to try to nullify their marriage. And successfully did so. They essentially forced Sherman Ferguson out of the state of Maine after this incident. So these legal boundaries are a clue as to the obstacles that African Americans and other people of color faced in the state of Maine and continue to face in the state of Maine in terms of having equal representation in the state legislature. As I'm sure many of you know, Rachel Talbot Ross is the very first African American woman to serve in the Maine state legislature. The very first. Her father was the very first African American man to serve in the Maine state legislature in the 1970s. We are far behind where we think we are in terms of equality in the state of Maine. And I think these primary sources give us a clue as to not only how we have, how this happened, how racism has played out in the state of Maine and systemic racism has played out in the state of Maine, but also how it can continue to affect the present day. So I'm going to skip back to the slave trade now. So the slave trade it's what I study. And I think this is one really important area of research that needs to be understood in the state of Maine, and how Maine and more broadly New England participated in the slave trade. There's a number of issues with assessing the slave trade. And I think this, if you're thinking about using this as an example in a classroom, it's a really great exercise in understanding primary sources and how to read primary sources and how to read against primary sources and understand where the lapses are and where the missing pieces are. And in the state of Maine, we have, a few different issues with understanding our participation in the slave trade. Number one is a lack of research. You'll be hard pressed to find a college course in the state of Maine on this history. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone teaching this in any other kind of classroom. So this is something that really needs, young people need to be encouraged to go and look at these kinds of sources and understand how it is that we have written this collective narrative that distances ourselves from the history of slavery. Another important aspect of this is our misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the slave trade. Slave trading vessels were merchant ships first. There were very few vessels that were only slave ships, especially after 1808, when the United States barred American participation in the slave trade. So most of these vessels that transported enslaved people transported all kinds of things as well. So many of the ships are clipper ships that we like to think of as just being cotton packets, moving cotton between the upper South and the lower South, or, Boston and other cities in the Northeast, also transported enslaved people as part of their cargo. So oftentimes they may only transport 5 or 10 people between Baltimore and New Orleans. But they were heavily engaged in this activity. It was a regular activity. And so when we think about our merchant history, our sort of very heroicized history, we have neglected to think about who benefited and who lost out of this arrangement. And of course, we have issues of archives being very small in New England, and many of them being sort of disconnected from each other, not digitized yet, but that does seem like that is beginning to change with efforts like what Maine State Museum and Maine Historical Society are doing, as well as other digital history projects, which I'll get into in a little bit. So after 1808, the legal participation of the slave trade ended by the United States. It was formally abolished. The British had done it the year prior. However, Americans actually participated far more in this illegal period after 1808 than they did during the legal period. And primarily, they were not bringing enslaved people to the United States. They were bringing enslaved people to Cuba and Brazil and other sugar-producing colonies. And this had everything to do with who was looking at American, who was trafficking patrolling the ports in the United States. We had American U.S. Navy. We had various port authorities that were watching for vessels coming in. Everyone had to pay taxes and insurance and that kind of thing. Enslaved people at auction would have been suspect if they did not speak English or if they had an accent, particularly after the 1830s. So people could be found out. And it was an increasingly serious offense throughout the early 19th century. There were a number of laws that were passed, but particularly after 1820, and 2 months after Maine became a state, during the very same Congress that was debating Maine statehood, a national the Act of 1820, which essentially just made participation in the slave trade piracy, and thus a capital offense, was passed. So our statehood and this slavery and the slave trade, the expanding slave trade of the early 19th century, were playing out at the same time. So, very much our statehood and the expansion of slavery westward and all of that is also tied to this deeply increasing global slave trade that's happening elsewhere. And you see here this image on the right. This is at the Penobscot Marine Museum. And they have begun to do some more research into their collections and thinking about what they have that is connected to slavery there. So I'm just going to briefly breeze through this story of one particular example of a Maine slave ship that was engaged in the slave trade in the 1850s, and that is the Ruthless Soul, which was constructed in Freeport by Rufus Soul. The Soul family was a very prominent shipbuilding family, merchant family in the town of Freeport. And what I've discovered is that the Souls also engaged in the slave trade, both the domestic slave trade, a number of their cotton packets and sugar packets transported as part of the legal domestic slave trade between the upper South and the lower South, as well as the foreign slave trade. And so on July 6, 1858, the Rufus Soul, which was sailing out of New Orleans, was consigned, which essentially means leased, to a notorious slave dealer in Matanzas, Cuba, Cristobal Valdez, for about $5,000, which was a huge amount of money. It was about twice the amount that a vessel of this size would normally have been consigned for a traditional merchant journey. C.J. Helm, the U.S. Consul General in Cuba, noted the brig's captain and crew had all taken the usual measures to conceal their illicit activities. Quote, all entries in the several record books, the ship's daily journal, the fee book, and the detailed list of seamanship discharged or deceased showing the foregoing facts. Essentially that they had hidden their activities and what they were doing in Cuba. And the American consul in Matanzas was in fact aware that this was happening before the journey commenced, but was essentially unable to stop it. Helm noted that during the same time period, British cruisers were boarding American vessels in Matanzas, causing a great uproar in the US. And this is all about the right of search and seizure, which had been established in particular after the War of 1812, which essentially said that British cruisers could not board American merchant vessels without probable cause. And in order for them to prove that a vessel was a slave vessel, they had to find either a slave deck built on board, or evidence of actual enslaved people, things like shackles and that sort of thing. But what these guys were doing, what these Maine merchants were doing, is they would send them to Cuba with lumber. And so while they were at sea, they would construct the slave deck. They would construct the casks for water. They would take the staves, the barrel staves that they often left Maine with, and carve them into spoons and utensils for enslaved people at sea. So this was a really deep level of hiding what they were doing. So during the week of October 10th, 1858, the British cruiser Viper sighted the Rufus Soul sitting in Cabenda Bay, Angola. The Viper had already captured the Kate Ellen, a schooner from Plymouth, Massachusetts, on September 15th, which had been outfitted as a slaver. The British commander of the Viper ordered the Rufus Soul boarded on the evening of October 11th, not the Rufus Soul, the Kate Ellen boarded on October 11th, 1858, and burned the vessel in the bay. So the Rufus Soul then eventually ends up in Matanzas, Cuba, and is successfully lands approximately 600 enslaved people in Cuba. We don't know how many people were embarked from Africa. During this time period, this late stage of the slave trade, the average mortality rate aboard a vessel was 30%. So this is double the mortality rate. Other Maine vessels like the brig Malaga, which was of Brunswick, had 900 people stuffed on board a very small vessel. And by the time they had not even left Africa, and by the time that they were captured by the British, 300 people had already suffocated inside the vessel. So this is a really, really horrific time period. And yet, how have we forgotten this? Because Rufus Soul, all I did to find this was Google. So this was not like some deep thing. And it didn't take much to Google Ruthless Soul before I found this. And you'll see on the left-hand side, recently the Freeport Historical Society purchased these two paintings of Rufus Soul and his wife Susan. Also, another slave ship was named after his wife, captured during the same time period. And yet they have been remembered as these really historic people, these heroic people that we uphold and we extol. And I think that this history really tells us that there's a lot about our story in the state of Maine that we just do not understand. And you can see here, we talk about the glorious merchant history and how important it was to our state's economy. If you look at this figure on the right, only Massachusetts had a higher percentage of sailors than we did. So of registered merchant seamen in the United States in the 1840s. So Maine and Massachusetts were dominating the merchant marine trade, both as sailors, captains, and as vessels. And so one of the things that I've begun to do by scouring through a lot of primary sources of various kinds, lots of captain's logs and consular documents and things like that, is to identify Maine vessels engaged in the slave trade during this time period. And you can see here the profits that come back to New England are really staggering. The estimated value of the slave fleet of New England, according to the New York Times in 1857, was $332 million. That was flowing back into New England, founding banks. The Bajewscott Bank in Brunswick was founded by a slave trader. The Bank of Salem in Massachusetts, which is still a bank, was founded by a slave trader. A number of the buildings that were eventually incorporated into the Peabody Essex Museum's holdings were built by slave traders, and yet we have completely ignored this in our history. So in the way that we think about our region, we think about the plantation houses of the South. Really, a lot of our captains' houses are the same type of thing. And I'm gonna breeze through this next one so that we have enough time for Kate to give her great presentation and some questions. Here's another interesting story of that you could incorporate into a history lesson on a number of fronts. And this is of the ship Rebecca, which was built in Brunswick by Joseph Badger in the early 1850s. And was consigned by the American Colonization Society. And the American Colonization movement was started in 1816 as a way to send free Black people back to Africa. Sometimes they went on their own because they wanted to, and sometimes they were forced. And Maine actually had a really huge role in the American colonization movement. There's a fascinating document in the Maine Historical Society that I was recently looking at of that Maine actually built a vessel specifically. The Maine Colonization Society built a vessel specifically to bring people back to Africa. So a lot of these vessels, this was a good way to make money. A lot of times what would happen is in the South during this period in the 1850s, if a slaveholder died, they would manumit to give the freedom to the enslaved people that they held as part of their probate. So when they would, the executor of the estate would have to arrange for these people to, there were a number of laws across the southern states that said if a slaveholder manumitted an enslaved person, they had to pay for their support, essentially. And one way to avoid doing this was just to pay to send them back to Africa. Liberia in the 1840s, 1850s was not necessarily a place you wanted to just be plunked into. Of course, there was a lot of disease. Most of these people, since the slave trade had been abolished by 1808, were born in America and families had lived in America for generations. They had no tie to Africa anymore for the most part because of the destructive nature of slavery. So the Rebecca was built by Badger after he successfully landed at least 2 other slave journeys aboard the Malaga, which I'd spoken about earlier, and the Porpoise, which was another slave ship that went to Brazil. And they chartered the Rebecca, and the captain was supposed to take these people to Liberia. And instead, what he tried to do was sell them in Cuba. And I suspect that this is a much bigger enterprise than what we currently know of, because this is not the only incident I found of this happening. And thankfully, the ship's surgeon aboard the vessel protested this action. And so they sent the Rebecca they did eventually bring these people to Liberia. And you can see this document on the right-hand side, which tells you of who was on board. And you can see a number of babies, tiny little babies on board this vessel that were sent to Liberia to endure this middle passage aboard a slave ship. Because after this, they brought these people to Liberia, they sailed down the coast, and they purchased 600 people, and they brought them to Cuba, and then the vessel was burned. 400 people. They successfully landed 400 people. They purchased approximately 600 people in Africa. And this is from a document, a newspaper article. And the vessel was destroyed, which happened to a lot of these ships. They made so much money during this time period that they could just destroy the vessel. So, I think these stories tell us, these histories tell us a lot about what we don't know about New England's history. And I think we can learn a lot about how this happened. How did we collectively forget this history? It can help us understand what is happening right now with fake news, and who is telling the story, and what are the narratives that they're telling, and what do the documents actually tell us. And there's a number of really good resources out there. I'm part of a nonprofit called the Atlantic Black Box, which we have a great bibliography page. We have a blog, a very active blog, where we have a number of institutions across the state who are digging into their archives and are looking to reassess what they have and really see what the connections are that are available. So that's a great place to start. And there's also slavevoyages.org, which has lesson plans, a 3D video, the database, which you can use for a number of reasons. It's a great qualitative database full of stuff you could do with it. And then the Maine State Archives has a great repository now for African American history. Our museum has the Talking About Race portal, which has a number of really helpful ways to lead these kinds of conversations, these difficult conversations in your classroom or in your lives with your own children, things like that. Historic Hudson Valley has a really fantastic new online exhibit called People Not Property, which I definitely encourage you all to look at, which has a great interactive timeline, lots of good things you could mine for. And then there's a brand new database, as in it actually doesn't officially launch until tomorrow. I heard about it today, called enslaved.org, which also cross-checks slavevoyages.org. It compiles lots of different databases. And so you can go on there and look up Maine. I found some really interesting things when I looked up Maine this morning, and find some really great online resources that are available to you. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kate Weber. And I see there's some stuff happening in the chat, so I'm going to check that, and I will stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that was a false alarm. I was in the chat. I was posting some of those links in case people wanted to click on them as we went through. So I'm going to take a minute just to take a breath, maybe pop some more. Kate, if you want to pop any links in that I missed from that resource page. And I did want to give folks the chance now to ask any questions that are right on the top of your brain. If you are still mulling things over, that's totally fine. I can launch into my presentation, and we are going to take at least 10 minutes at the end to do a Q&A very informally. And we're fine to stay a little bit later than noon today if you are. So we want to be here to answer any questions that you have. All right, so I don't see any questions in the Q&A or the chat. Feel free to put those in at any point as they come up. All right, so for now, I am going to share my screen. The quick presentation. All right. Okay, so I want to thank Kate McMahon so much for presenting that history, and thank her for her work in general. You may have noticed that these are not stories that we hear every day. Your students, this is going to be new to your students. This is probably new to their parents and their grandparents. This is a subject matter that is way too rarely discussed in Maine today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to thank the folks who are listening to this recording after the fact. We are really excited about the opportunity to get students not only learning about this, but also participating in these investigations, because for better or for worse, this is not a subject matter that has been explored. So your students are really going to be on the forefront of learning about this and talking about this and unearthing new resources. So today I want to show you just a quick look through a toolkit that you can use right away in your classroom. The Maine State Museum had a bicentennial exhibit that was open for one day before the pandemic closed the museum down. And as part of that, we designed a whole bunch of different themed materials. The theme that we're talking about today, obviously, is the connection between Maine and slavery. It is not an exhaustive guide to that. It's really looking at that statehood period, and it's a quick overview. So each one of our packets includes a teacher guide with recommendations on how to set up the activity. It also has, we modified that a little bit and have a version for digital learning. So if you are working with a classroom remotely, this is fortunately pretty well suited for that, because you're really looking at images that can be up on a student device, and they can respond to it in a prompt or a comment forum, whatever that is. Each packet also has an introduction with background information for teachers and students. They've got recommended reflection questions and learning goals. The real focus of these packets is that themed set of Maine-based primary sources. So we've got historic documents, artifacts, and images related to the different topics, and the students are diving into those and investigating them. And we also have analysis worksheets. So students are probably pretty used to reading an article or a paragraph and getting information out of it. They might not be as comfortable analyzing an image or an artifact. So if you tell a student to look at a historic photo, to look at an old shoe, how on earth do I learn about history from this shoe? So we have these worksheets that they can fill out either online, or they could print it out in the classroom and write in. And it takes them step by step through a few easy to answer questions, and they kind of build up in complexity, so that by the end of completing the worksheet, the students realize they actually know a little bit more about things than they thought they did. We've already seen William Pepperell here today from the Boston newsletter excerpt, and this is an example of one of our primary sources, which the Peabody Essex Museum gave us permission to use. So just to give you a quick example of how this activity works out, we've got 6 different primary sources, different images and documents and artifacts, and a student would be assigned one, or they could choose one that they want to dive into. So if a student is looking at this portrait here, they don't know anything other than what they see. We don't give them any background information on what these items are. So they've got to look at the clothing that they see. They try to figure out what's going on in the background. Students that we've worked with have really noticed his calves. They talk about his calves a lot. They make guesses about what he's holding, who he might be, and try to learn what they can just from this one portrait. Another student might be diving into this advertisement that Kate talked about earlier that talks about, they might notice, okay, William Pepperell, I saw his name in that portrait over there. And if they're looking at him from the perspective of a slaveholder who is trying to recover an actual human that he views as property, that's going to give them a very different image of this man than they get from the portrait. So we're encouraging them to make comparisons and draw connections between these different items. All the things that students gain from learning about through primary sources are present here. They're practicing close observation, they're developing their visual literacy skills, they're practicing analyzing and making inferences. And one thing that we really like about this activity is that students get into the idea of solving mysteries, of investigating. There's more fun involved in it. There's more of a sense of ownership if they're deciding what they want to dive into. We've had students who come up with really wild, conspiracies and look for hidden symbols and get out their magnifying glasses and zoom in on things. So students, this is a way to involve them in the work of a historian in a pretty great introductory way, or if they've already had practice with primary sources, then they'll be ready to go. So I'm going to show you now how to get to this. And I am hoping that, my screen share might just still show my PowerPoint. So I'm going to exit out of this and jump into the website. All right, so all of these materials are available for free download. This is the basic Maine State Museum homepage. If you navigate over to our Learn menu, online lessons and resources, we have two different bicentennial teaching materials segments here. We're working with a primary source that's today. And these are the different themes we explore. They are broken down by grade level for the Slavery in Maine unit. This is specifically recommended for 6th to 12th graders, just because of the nature of the documents. So you can download the teacher guide. You can look at our introduction, which has a little tiny bit of the great content that we just heard from Kate McMahon. I would recommend, if this is kind of a starting point with a basic big picture view, a summary of what was going on, I would encourage you and your students to dive into this a little bit deeper. One difficulty with the subject matter is it's not like you can go to one comprehensive guide that has all of the information on the history of Maine and slavery. Kate McMahon's work is, she's doing it right now. The Atlantic Black Box Project, we have all these institutions doing it. It can make it hard for teachers such as yourselves to teach this in the classroom because you have to have some foundation in it before you can share with your students. So we wanted this to just kind of be a starting point. We have the primary sources themselves. So a student would get this. Anything that's written out, we have a transcribed version here. So they could go through the different artifacts. And then once they have filled out those worksheets, talked about it, made all their guesses, they then can get these source labels. This is what you would see if you were at the museum, the little label up on the wall. So we've got all the background information talking about what's actually going on here. This is a fun moment with students too, because they're often surprised by what they found out about, and they're surprised by the level that they were actually able to guess. And our analysis worksheets are here. You can download these and print them out. You can also have a virtual assignment. Students can fill it out and submit it to you that way. And then we have some optional resources here as well for further learning. So I'm going to exit out of this. Okay. And give you my, contact information here. So I do want to encourage folks. I'm right here in Maine, have plenty of time to work with your classroom. If you would like to use this but are having trouble getting started, if you want to adapt it for your particular group of students, if you want me to work with your students on this material, I'm more than happy to. My email address is kate.weber@maine.gov, and I'm going to exit out of here now and open it up to any questions that we have. I see there's some stuff in the chat. Okay, link for the recording. Video will be posted there. All right, so I'm not seeing any specific questions, so I want to give folks the chance to type anything if you'd like to.
While everyone is either thinking about any questions or typing up their questions right now, yes, so the video and the PowerPoint from both Kate and the PowerPoint from Kate will both be included up on the website as well, so you'll have access to go back and look at those. I'm hoping to get that up. I can usually get that turned around within a day, and with an 11 o'clock start, I can probably get that up hopefully by the end of today. Is there any questions that anybody has for either of the Kates?
Well, if nobody has any questions, I do want to give a plug to come check out the museum's website. Go to atlanticblackbox.com and look at the resources that are available there. If you're feeling lost and would like to do some background reading before you embark on this, we have a great list of bibliographical lists. So, please check that out.
We do have a question. The question is, this might be more specific, but do you have any knowledge of resources regarding minstrelsy in New England, if I pronounced that correctly?
Yeah, minstrelsy. I don't know of any specific resources available on that. I know that there certainly is a deep history of this in Maine. I wrote a little bit about it in my my master's thesis, which if you Google my name and go to academia.edu, my master's thesis is available, as well as some other papers that I've written about Malaga Island are up there. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Malaga Island story. There's also a learning unit that is up on the Maine State Museum website. There is certainly a history of it. I don't know if there's anything about Maine specifically. There probably are works about New England more broadly, about various groups that have, engaged in that, people and groups that engaged in that. I know there is certainly a deep history of it in Boston. So yeah, it's a little bit later than the time period that I tend to study. But I would definitely do a Google search, and it's certainly an area worth studying for people to understand. It happened in Warren, Maine in the 1930s. So that's the context that I have studied it in.
And I do know, I'm going to pop it in the chat. There's a link to a TED Talk. There's a musician named Kafari who is in Portland and works with Jake Hoffman, who's a banjo player, and Kafari plays the bones and piano. And they have both, I know, as performers and musicians, have looked into the history of cultural appropriation in folk music. That might be something interesting to share with your students as well.
Any other questions, Jane? Thank you for submitting the question. I have seen some thank yous and great presentations from the participants or from the attendees. Last call. We won't keep anybody past the hour if we don't have to. So I will take a quick moment to just say thank you to Kate McMahon for joining us from the Smithsonian, although Zoom has made so much more possible nowadays in this world. Thank you, Kate, for your continued work and guidance in these primary source sets and continue moving these forward. We continue to try to collaborate as much as possible and continue to just produce sets. If you'd like, Kate Weber, this might be an opportunity to let the attendees know what other primary source sets are still in the works.
Yep, yeah, so the bicentennial sets were our pilot round. We are just putting up online a set of primary sources around the history of pandemics in Maine. For obvious reasons, that's something that we figure students in this coming year and the years beyond are going to have a very personal connection to. And then up following that, we're partnering with a statewide group called Freedom and Captivity, and we're going to be looking at some primary sources around the idea of incarceration in Maine and the history of that. So stay tuned. We always have something else in the works.
Awesome. Well, again, attendees, I will be emailing you everything that you need from today's session. Kate Weber, thank you. Kate McMahon, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And they will send me those PowerPoints. I'll get all that posted up hopefully within a day. And thank you to everybody for attending.
Great. And thank you, Joe.
Thank you.